Before voters elected Arnold Schwarzenegger to be governor of California, he already held another prestigious title, Mr. Universe. Today, Schwarzenegger is regarded as one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time. Following his career, millions of athletes have attempted to attain the same levels of success. The bodybuilders who compete in these shows have fueled the popular saying, "The day you start lifting is the day you become forever small." While this quote is seen as a motivating mantra, some athletes take it a step too far. This belief that they're never big enough can develop into a subtype of body dysmorphic disorder called muscle dysmorphia.
It's beyond just kind of having transient thoughts about it. It's really having a lot of obsessive thinking around it. With muscle dysmorphia, it's individuals who either think that they look too scrawny or too weak. They fear that they're going to lose their muscle size. And these are thoughts that really carry with them throughout the day.
That's Dr. Roberto Olivardia, a clinical psychologist and lecturer in the Department of Psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. He says muscle dysmorphia is usually coupled with compulsive or avoidant behaviors.
These are not individuals that you'll see at Venice Beach taking their shirts off, proudly. In fact, the avoidant behaviors are often, despite many of the men that I've worked with muscle dysmorphia who other people would objectively say have a good physical physique, they don't see that. And so they will often cover up their bodies, wear multiple layers, wear long sleeve shirts in 90-degree weather. Sometimes if they don't feel particularly fit that day, they won't leave their house.
As you can imagine, many cases of muscle dysmorphia impair not only a person's mental health, but also their relationships and careers.
I've had patients who, because of their compulsion of needing to go to the gym, are late for work, sometimes don't show up for work if they don't feel that they look good enough. So this is not just vanity, this is a serious issue.
Olivardia says the condition can also ruin aspects of bodybuilding itself. In fact, some competitors who are successful still view themselves as not enough.
Even when they're on the stage, it's not that they feel great about their appearance. It's almost this kind of like white knuckling experience of, okay, did I pass the test? How did I do? And often even when they win the competition, are immediately now fearful of, am I going to win the next one? Am I going to lose muscle mass? Oh my gosh, that guy is bigger, than I am. So it's still riddled with a lot of insecurities.
Although women also suffer from muscle dysmorphia, research suggests that the disorder mainly affects men. Olivardia was involved in a recent study that interviewed men in the bodybuilding community. Instead of diagnosing these men by a clinical definition, researchers asked bodybuilders how they would define muscle dysmorphia and if they see it as a problem. This anthropological perspective comes from the primary author, Dr. Mayor Underwood, while Olivardia's main focus centered around building a psychological framework.
And what was fascinating about that study is, one, that she even was able to collect it, because it's a community that isn't particularly keen to researchers kind of asking and inquiring about. It's a very kind of insulated environment in bodybuilding communities. I think a lot of times they feel that they're not understood in terms of their investment in bodybuilding. And we're not saying that all bodybuilders have muscle dysmorphia or that all bodybuilders have a psychological condition. We're not saying that at all. However, like ballet, you'll see a high prevalence of anorexia and eating disorders in ballerinas. That doesn't mean all ballerinas have an eating disorder, but it definitely is a community of which you're going to see that pathology.
That element of honesty is something Olivardia says has been missing from many of his own studies that are more clinical.
A lot of men reported, yes, there is something kind of very pathological about bodybuilding, very pathological about this obsession that even if you don't go into it with muscle dysmorphia, there were a lot of men who would say you're going to end up with it because you're just in this kind of echo chamber of men who are talking about this percent body fat and that percent body fat and this steroid and this scrutiny of body types.
But for some bodybuilders, this excessive analysis of their physique wasn't viewed as a problem.
Some were impaired by it and felt that it really got in the way. Other men said, well, if you're going to have any kind of quote unquote addiction, this might be the best one to have. So they had this sort of element to it of not looking at it as something that they needed treatment for, that it was just sort of part of the culture.
To the untrained eye, Olivardia says that some behaviors may appear pathological until you understand their cultural context.
If we think about, I don't know, like other phenomenon that we have, like let's say the idea of talking to dead people, now from a clinical perspective, if a patient is like, yes, I was speaking to the spirit of my dead aunt, by a medical model perspective, we would think, okay, is this a little psychosis? Is this, well, in certain cultures, that is a totally normal part of someone's culture, is that if a relative is deceased, that they will report talking to their spirit. And it's not something that's labeled as crazy or something that's labeled as pathological. So we know that even in psychology, there are these culturally oriented ways that we have to be aware of and understand through that lens. And this was something I thought was kind of doing that as well. It's like, well, let's look at it through the lens of how people within that community define it.
And what they discovered was that the community's definition wasn't so different from the clinical one. While Olivardia treats many men with muscle dysmorphia, it's not typically what brings them into his office. Oftentimes they're seeking help for depression due to an injury or health problem caused by steroid use. Then, in the appointment, they come to realize the underlying problem is muscle dysmorphia. Olivardia says this blindness to the root cause is a reason why many with the condition don't seek treatment. But that's not to say these men don't notice their behavior. Bodybuilders in the study recognized the consequences of their lifestyle.
They talked about the interference with life functioning. They talked about how it took over. They talked about never being satisfied with their bodies and the perfectionism.
However, many still saw this thought pattern as a necessary evil, the ultimate dedication. And Olivardia says the interesting aspect about dysmorphia and eating disorders is how intertwined they are with culture. He can see the cultural influence even in the last 30 years by looking at his young patients pre-social media versus his patients now.
It's not even about the profile of, oh, this is my accomplishments and my religious affiliation and my whatever. It's the picture. Like, is it worth you swiping left or right? Like, it comes down to, just the idea of how young people date and socialize. That emphasis on physicality, it's no wonder we're seeing these problems not only rising, but in younger people. I'm hearing things from 11 and 12-year-old boys that years ago I was hearing from 15, 16-year-old boys. Like, it's just the accessibility to different imagery.
Olivardia says social media can glorify muscle dysmorphia, which isn't the case for other disorders. In society, bodybuilders are constantly rewarded for their extreme dedication. Even outside of competition, millions on social media celebrate their lifestyle, making it more difficult for them to want to seek help. And though treatment can restore their balance and peace, the hesitancy usually stems from self-imposed restrictions.
I'm not going to be promoting anabolic steroid use. That part of a treatment plan would be to cease the use of steroids. That we're not going to be working out 8 hours a day at the gym. That's a compulsive behavior. So there's a lot of resistance sometimes in wanting to get treatment because they know, okay, if I don't engage in these behaviors, I'm going to lose muscle mass. But the treatment is, and part of the work is realizing even if they do, number one, it doesn't mean that they lose it all and that they're suddenly the opposite of who they are. But also this is an issue around one's sense of self too, of who am I? And those voices in that study really spoke to how a lot of people's identity was completely revolved within this, that the idea of losing that was very threatening for them.
Which means that a lot of the treatment focuses on helping men realize who they are outside of bodybuilding.
A lot of times with research studies that I've done, it's the first time that they've even thought about it. Like sometimes like, you know what, this probably, I do kind of feel like I'm in a hamster wheel here. Like, I don't know where the end goal of this is. Like, is it, I just have to keep getting 10 more pounds of muscle, 10 more pounds of muscle, like win. If I'm a bodybuilder, keep winning. And then what happens if I don't win? And then I feel like my mission is to just win so that I'm affirming my value as a person or my worth. It goes beyond now like this sort of athletic, aspect, and even like if you're an athlete, yeah, that's great. You could be ambitious and want to come in first place, but that is not the totality of your identity.
So even though some athletes view muscle dysmorphia as a tool in their careers, Olivardia believes the bodybuilding community can find a healthy balance.
I look at this paper as really being a great opening to a dialogue of just how we understand a certain disorder and how people who struggle with that, and I mean, again, even that bias of saying struggle with it. I mean, some people might not refer to it as a struggle, how we can hear that non-judgmentally and then utilize that in my role, at least as a clinical psychologist, in when I treat people, or how we can outreach and thinking about making sure that people are doing things healthily. Because again, neither Dr. Underwood or I are saying that all bodybuilding should be banned and it's this bad thing at all. I guess it's trying to find where is that line of the bodybuilder that's able to have proper boundaries, in terms of their health, and the ones that don't.
You can find more information about Dr. Roberto Olivardia and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. I'm Reed Pence. Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
Looking in the mirror and not recognizing yourself is very painful and a very strange feeling.
When losing your hair feels like losing your sense of identity.
Then can we end the HIV epidemic by 2030?
Those who have been diagnosed with HIV are living much longer, to the overall rates of HIV coming significantly down.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
You can tell where the village ends and the resort starts because that's where you start to see palm trees.
Understanding the fallout from fast-expanding beach resorts. Then,
is it fruity or is it something else first? I think that does an enormous amount for grounding you in what to expect from the wine.
Diving into the study of wine, a beverage that dates back to 6000 BC. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.